Hi, my name is Tom Collins. I'm the Executive Director of the Arizona Citizens Clean Elections Commission, the state's voter education agency. We're here today with Beth Lewallen of Italicized Consulting to talk about the state budget. In the spring, every year, the legislature and the governor work on the state's budget, its spending blueprint for the next fiscal year. Beth is a public policy consultant and an expert in Arizona's budget process. She's worked for numerous government officials and has been rated by the Arizona Capital Times readers as the best Twitter in Arizona for Arizona politics at Italicized AZ. So Beth, thank you very much for joining us today to share with voters a little bit of your expertise. Why is the budget such an important thing?
Thanks for having me, Tom. This is such an important issue because the budget really is the fuel behind the policy changes that the legislature enacts every year. You know, the priorities, many of them require funding, and so the state budget really helps, add resources to the priorities that the legislature establishes.
Sure. So this process is pretty involved. It starts in January. Well, the legislature starts up, the budget process starts up, and the legislature has a version and the governor has a version. And when we say the legislature, just for purposes of discussion here, we really mean the majority party in the legislature, which currently is the Republican Party. So can you talk a little bit about that kickoff process, what those documents mean and how they serve?
Yeah, January really starts with a lot of excitement when the legislature comes into session. The Joint Legislative Budget Committee, we call it JLBC, it's the staff at the legislature. And so they put together what's called a baseline budget. It's a continuation of funding that was approved the last year. And it really is not a political document. It outlines the priorities that are already committed to, and it outlines the money that the legislature will have to spend in that next year. And so they released that kind of as a framework for discussion going forward. The governor's budget is a much more detailed document and really outlines the state leaders' priorities for the year ahead in great detail to kind of set the tone for the budget negotiations. And those negotiations go for months throughout the legislative session.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, it is an involved process, and it is an extensive negotiation. Well, who are the negotiators for this process?
On the public side, the members of the House and Senate Appropriations Committees play a really key role in deciding what budget proposals move forward during the early parts of the legislative session. They approve or deny funding proposals that are for specific things that they want to be included in the legislative budget. Behind the scenes, the people who really are the key players are the House and Senate leadership teams. As you mentioned, those are members of the majority party, and the appropriations chairs. And so they really bring together the expertise that comes from those leaders that have been talking to the members of the legislature to say, what is it that you need to see in the state budget in order to vote for it? In the House, you have to have 31 votes in order to pass something. In the Senate, you need 16. And of course, you need the governor's signature on it. And so really, you get together the numbers and the members that you think you can work with. Now, often that is just within the majority party. They really start trying to find the priorities within their own party members to move that forward. Sometimes they can get bipartisan agreement on specific parts of the budget. For the most part, it really is the people at the table are the majority party.
Sure. And then when we talk about the governor's role here, obviously, the governor, as you said, has to sign the budget. But I think that the governor's role here is bigger than that in Arizona. Can you tell us a little bit about what role the governor and the governor's staff play in that process?
Yeah, they are very closely involved through the entire budget negotiation process. The governor's budget really sets the tone for negotiations in January because it outlines the priorities that office wants included. And so the framework for those negotiations, they are at the table for much of the negotiation behind the scenes. And then, of course, the governor's support is needed to sign it. In Arizona, the governor does have line item veto authority, which means there's some ability for a governor to take a budget bill and say, okay, I don't want these things and cross those out. That rarely happens. And so most of the compromise is made during the budget negotiation process.
Sure. And then as the legislature, so the session begins, we've gone through several weeks. Right now, for example, as we're speaking, it's something like the 102nd or 103rd day of the legislative session. It's been going on for something like 14 weeks, I want to say. When do people start to look for this document emerging for purposes of people voting on it?
Throughout the session, we're looking for the documents. Everyone wants to know what the priorities are that are emerging during the negotiations. April is a key point in the negotiations because there's a panel of economists that meets to evaluate the state revenues and really give a more solid sense of how much funding the legislature has to spend in that year. The budget has to be enacted at the end of the fiscal year, which is June 30th. And so if you don't have a budget in place by July 1st, you don't know how the money will go to state agencies to really operate the government. So there's a pretty firm deadline there that motivates the discussions as you move forward.
Sure. So there's a couple of sort of big issues or sort of structural issues in the way the budget comes together that I was hoping you might be able to help highlight for voters. The first is that when you talk about those frameworks, the governor's framework and the legislature's framework, a lot of dollars are already allocated. So what's the scope of the unallocated dollars that the legislature is working with when they're talking about the budget?
It's a really important part of understanding budget negotiations because the legislature doesn't have control over much of the spending. It's about 2/3 is already programmed in for the really big ticket items. It's, education programs. It's the state's healthcare programs through Access and the Department of Health Services. State prisons consume a large percentage of the general fund. Things that already are in place and because of state law already have to be funded at the population growth for those programs. And so the percentage the legislature actually has to allocate is not very large when you really start looking at all the proposals that you have. And there's also a really important question about what is one-time funding versus ongoing spending that is a question when you're putting together a spending plan, because if you only have money coming in for 1 year, you can only appropriate it or assign it for that 1 year, not for commitments going forward into the next years.
Sure, and that's something that I think we've heard those who've seen anything about the budget so far this year. I think have seen an emphasis on one-time money or one-time dollars. I know in my own local legislators newsletter, that's a term that gets used a lot. This year, the legislature thinks that the legislative analysts have assessed that there's going to be more money than there was last year. So are those the kinds of situations that tend to cause one-time dollars to be a priority?
Yeah, there are any number of things that really can make it one time. This year in particular, we have so much money coming in through federal aid for the pandemic. That's a major factor going forward that you don't know that will continue into the next year. And so it really does shape what you can use the money for, because if it's going to be a project that will continue into the next year, then you'll run into what the legislature calls a structural balance problem, which is, we have the money this year, but if we commit to spending it for next year, then we have a deficit.
Sure. No, that makes sense, and that's another term that people will hear in the legislature is structural deficit, which basically, as Beth said, basically means that the need has been put into law without the financial commitment that's necessary to sustain it. There are a couple other big terms that if you listen to local podcasts or you're on Twitter, that you hear around the state budget. One of the terms we hear a lot is rainy day fund. The state has seemingly always had a rainy day fund, but when people throw that term around, what are they really talking about?
Yeah, it's a fancy term for the state savings account, basically. You'll also hear it called the Budget Stabilization Fund. It's there to create a balance the legislature can use if there are funding shortfalls in programs. And so the idea is have money you can go use to fill that gap one time rather than having to cut the program in order to balance the budget.
Sure. There are a couple other things that I think people will start to see in this process. And they're mechanical, but they're also kind of distinct from other bills people may be following in the legislature. And so there are two terms I'd like you to shed some light on for voters, and they are feed bill and burb. Which is spelled BRB, and doesn't mean be right back. So what is the feed bill? Because I always think of horses, and what is a burb?
Those are very good questions, and it can be very confusing if you're starting to follow the budget for the first time. The feed bill is a very special piece of legislation that actually writes the checks to fund the state government. And so it's a very lengthy bill with a whole lot of numbers in it because it just is going through and saying, here's the funding, here's where it goes. It becomes effective as soon as the governor signs it. And so it really is like writing the checks to help fund the state government. The burb, which is a very clever term, stands for Budget Reconciliation Bill. Those bills are part of the state budget, but they include the policy changes that are necessary to enact the funding priorities that were in the feed bill. And so you have one for each big topic in state government: health, health and human services, education, procedures, kind of how the government functions. And a lot of times you'll see policy tweaks in there that reflect the priorities, they needed to enact in order to get the votes to pass the budget.
Sure. So, one of the things that I think people may wonder about the process, and certainly we want to share with voters, is, what's the best resource for tracking budget information that's out there?
It can be difficult to find information, because so much of the conversation does happen between legislators while they're figuring out their priorities. The legislative budget staff, it's called the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, they have a website that has all the most up-to-date information. And so if you go to azleg.gov and then find the JLBC tab at the top of the page, that has links to how much, bills will cost, how much is there in state revenue month by month, and then the latest budget documents as they're available. So to the extent that the information is published, that's the best place to find it.
And I will let everybody in on a not so well kept secret at the Capitol in Phoenix, which is that following Beth's Twitter at Italicized AZ is the way that an awful lot of people, including myself, can get up to date on budget issues really quickly, because she really is Beth really has created a really important public resource there, and it really is a bona fide expert in this process. If you want to get in touch with your lawmakers and other elected officials during this process, you can log on to our website and go to our Find Your Elected Officials tab, where you can enter your home address, and it will bring you the contact information for your local elected officials for you to contact them. But I want to thank Beth Lewallen for joining us. It's been wonderful to get some insight into this process. And again, we recommend you give her a follow at Italicized AZ. Thank you very much, Beth, for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much for covering this important issue.
And thank you all for tuning in. We will see you soon online.